This might sound a bit bizarre, but when you think about it, the rationale for the invention of every religion is that we are perceptually impaired. There are things about our context that we apparently need to know about as a species in order to thrive, and yet the claim of spiritual traditions is we can't ordinarily perceive these things, and that's why religion has to exist to tell us about them. In this series, I've been attempting to illustrate the biological basis for this perceptual impairment that makes us genuinely unable to read our context accurately. I want to propose that what we think of as a spiritual realm is in fact the remnants of a credible biological sense perception, an ancient ability to glean much more information about our natural environment than we currently can. It's an ability that's now faded in us, but one that does remain in other animals. In this episode, I want to present you with the exact circumstances as to how I believe we've come to lose a lot of this perceptual acuity, and I'll also be illustrating the styles of perception that I think we've lost. Now, religion is often conflated with morality, and the true meaning of morality is really interchangeable with the meaning of intelligence and with the meaning of sanity, because intelligence, sanity, and morality are about your ability to accurately map what's going on around you and then behave in such a way that as you meet your own needs, you meet the needs of the environment that supports you. Because if you don't achieve those two things together, you harm your environment, bringing about the demise of your species long term, and these actions are contrary to sanity, morality, and intelligence. So these three terms refer to your ability to match the pattern of your perception and behavior with the pattern of your environment. In the rainforest, our perception was aligned with what in our environment we needed to understand, and we felt compelled to behave in a resonant way with that through instinct. Animals in their natural habitats are a near perfect physical and mental reflection of their surround, because it seems as though DNA works like a ledger system, which is constantly proposing or possibly fixating new mutations and the things they express, and in doing so, it's asking the environment, are you like this? Are you like this? Does this mutation better mirror your needs? Or could this direction be a viable one to go in? To this, nature can answer yes, if the pattern of where it is and where it could go is well matched by the mutation, that mutation will be supported and will thrive. But if the mutation clashes with the environmental pattern and can't be assimilated, the environment says no by causing it to die. So organisms are successful if they are a good mirror image of their changing surround over a long period of time. For humans, it's different. Our ability to reflect the dynamics of our environment changed for the worse as soon as we started living on the savannah because of the speed at which we moved there. An indication that we did make this move very quickly is the fact that we never apparently lived on the savannah without the aid of tools, and if we had have moved gradually, our species would have evolved into something more like baboons, so the tools wouldn't be necessary, we'd be physically equipped to live there unaided. But because we were short of this evolutionary time, we needed to create what I'm going to call 4 protective bridges, or arks, between us and this new environment that we didn't quite fit. And it was these bridges, along with the exodus from the rainforest itself, that conspired to impede our ability to read our context properly, even though the bridges were crucial in protecting us from the dangers we now faced. So what are the bridges? Well, the first one I've just mentioned. To bridge the gulf between what the savannah demanded of us physically and what we were capable of physically, we needed tools. So bridge 1 is technology. For instance, we didn't have the speed or the sharp teeth to take down prey animals, and so we threw rocks and created arrows. We didn't have the sense perception to detect threats far off, so we harnessed the power of fire to scare things away from approaching us in the first place. Our stomach acid couldn't deal with some of the pathogens on raw meat or the dense cellulose in some raw vegetables, so we started cooking our food, and basically our entire lives on the savannah relied upon our ability to use innovative thought and create artifacts that would protect and sustain us. So that's bridge one, and I'm going to draw this bridge as a ring around us because on the savannah we had to effectively live within this technological buffer zone, so it became like a 360-degree interface between us and the natural world. In a way, you'd think technology would be all we'd need to survive, but there are a few problems with this shield of tech, and the one that we'll deal with here is that this was allowing us to live in an environment that was totally alien. So the instincts we had, which had evolved in the rainforest, no longer matched the phenomena we were encountering on the savannah. This might not sound like a big deal, but actually it's as bad as modern man moving to a place where the objects no longer correspond to his eyes. Instinct was a major sense perception, and it was now one that didn't reliably work. Again, if we'd have made this move slowly, our instincts would have had time to adapt. But we were short of this evolutionary time, and this created the need for Bridge 2, which addressed that gulf between what the savannah required us to read about its features and what we could read naturally through instinct. So with our forest-based instincts incapable of decoding the things around us on the savannah, we had to start reading a lot of the world around us using different parts of the brain, parts that had evolved for rational thought, based on ratios, based on measurement and problem solving. So an example of this change in our mode of perception is that in the rainforest we would instinctively read the shape of a scorpion as not as scary as the shape of a spider. Supposing scorpions in the forest then were, as they generally are now, not poisonous. Out on the savannah though, scorpions can be deadly. So that instinctive reading of this shape is now out of date. This creature registers as comparatively benign, but it isn't, meaning you would need to cancel out that lack of concern in your brain and replace it with a symbolic memory with attached attributes that you'd learned and stored away using rational thought. And we would have had to do this for many animals, plants and fungi on the savannah, which looked like things in the forest, but were actually other things, and often things that were dangerous, or which we just didn't recognize whatsoever. Also, behaviourally and socially, we'd have to devise new ways of responding to an array of novel environmental demands that went against our forest-based instincts. So here's what this new way of relating to the environment might look like in the brain. Our context catalogue is thought to be written into the right brain hemisphere, and this used to throw up instinctive responses to environmental stimuli of which the specific physical details had been mapped in the left hemisphere, i.e. spider shape equals jump back, whereas the sight and scent of a fruit equals come here, eat me. So once more on the savannah, because some instinctive compulsions would now be mismatched with what we'd have to do in reality, we'd need to consciously cancel out a lot of these and replace them with learned symbolic, rational concepts. And if we wanted to communicate our discoveries to others, we'd need associated mouth noises or words with which we could then collectively catalogue new phenomena through shared experience. So novelty being all around on the savannah, caused the need for our modern style of language and the underlying way of thinking, which I'm calling Bridge 2, symbolic mapping, or you can think of this as rational thought. As discussed in episode 2, other animals use rational thought as well to measure distances, for object permanence, for facial recognition, for geographical mapping. But a lot of the meaning in life's constants comes from instinct, so they lean much more into that than we humans do today. And this may be to blame for our unusually active default mode network in the brain that looks like it gets wired that way as we learn symbolic mapping. The default mode network does involve regions that deal with the spatial and temporal relationships needed in rational thought, along with the memory it uses as well. And this way of thinking may also be the reason why we have a slightly underactive right brain hemisphere, because we're often having to suppress its messages as many are now out of date. There's also a bigger calculating area at the front of the right brain hemisphere. Is that necessary to moderate meaning? There's also a bigger memory area at the back of the left hemisphere. Is that needed to snapshot novel details and parcel them into icons for future reference? I would suggest that because we switched to a rational style of decoding the world at this point when we left the rainforest, our instinct evolution was rather suspended, so that even today a lot of our instincts pertain to the forest, because that's when that way of thinking stopped evolving to a great extent, and rational thought began largely, though not entirely, taking its place. Now here's perhaps the most strange aspect of all this. If you've watched episode 3, you'll know that I suggest, in addition to us gauging meaning through our instinctive reading of shapes, sounds, scents, and so on, there was also once a catalogue of psychedelic style imagery that used to label the world around us as well, through brightly coloured visuals and very specific feeling states. This would have been a feature of our ordinary perception before rational thought, Bridge 2, started overwriting pieces of that on the savannah. But it would also have been heavily modulated by the chemistry of fungi and plants. So you know how fungi and plants can avoid being eaten by tasting bad or by being poisonous? Well, I would suggest another tool at their disposal when dealing with animals is psychedelic messaging. So in the old days, when we ate something that didn't want to be eaten by us, it might actually cause us to see a demon or feel a profound sense that something was wrong in that part of the forest, that it was haunted there or something like that. And this response doesn't come about from the plant or fungus attempting to make it happen. That relationship between us and the organism might crystallize and be selected for over time through chemistry if it's what worked to maintain the balance of the wider ecosystem. A visual language like this is evident in the physical appearance of many animals, where, for example, you see these predator-style eye markings on the wings of a butterfly. That's not the butterfly trying to do that, and of course it's not a real predator, but it is a signal that's evolved to say to certain other animals, run away. So what exists in the physical world, I'm suggesting, also exists in the mental world of individual animals, and it's still invoked by some plant and fungal chemistry in humans today. Similarly, when we ate a different organism that actually wanted us to hang around for 8 hours, so it could bank on collecting our manure at some point, or on using whatever other animal services it needed, our rational DMN-based thoughts that we were using to amble around looking for food or looking for a mate would just be dialed down with chemistry, and the pleasant visual patterns and spectres it engendered, so that we'd stop doing what we were doing and possibly also experience very profound moral or contextual insights about our relationship to the ecosystem, often involving love for the plants and fungi, for example. That's the correct way of mapping those things we need to serve and protect. Furthermore, if our ancestors had have been in this area before us, we could read these feeling states from fungi and plants as a reliable map of where in the landscape it was safe for our species to relax without the threat of predators. More on that in episode 1. However, these psychedelic-style environmental instructions and our resting psychedelic style of perception that was there even without the modulating chemistry, practically all had to be cancelled out after we left the rainforest, because in our new environment of the savannah, a lot of the archetypes, patterns and compulsions which pertained to the old one didn't line up either. For example, dimethyltryptamine, DMT, a chemical present in the plants that used to form our staple diet in the forest, would suspend rational thought when we lived in the trees. It would conjure up these hominids and images and patterns in our minds to tell us, this is how to treat me. This is a portrait of me as a friendly hominid like you. Engaging with this information exchange was appropriate in the rainforest because the DMT there appeared in the trees that fed us. So this would be the right place to cease our own rational ambitions for a while and chill out and plug into the environment's needs, which are our own needs by proxy. DMT appears on the savannah to communicate with animals there. But because the savanna trees didn't provide fruit in the quantities we needed, the DMT in this new situation would have been telling us to chill out in the wrong place. We wouldn't be getting enough calories by hanging around in these trees. This DMT would also be shutting down the rational thought upon which we now really relied to problem solve our way into hunting and gathering in this novel situation. So the only people in our group who did survive were those who were quite resistant to DMT. We're their descendants, so now we're all resistant to it. We've got an enzyme in our stomachs, monoamine oxidase, which blocks its path to our brain. If it does reach our brain, artificially through injection or inhalation, in a legal setting of course, we've still got that ancient circuitry to decode it. So we know there was this evolutionary U-turn at some point. However, this historical development where we blocked major neurotransmitters like this that were telling us how to map our original environment relationally was like shutting down a sense perception, and it was a darkly significant factor in us being able to think so independently from our environment. And thinking independently from your environment is unsustainable, of course, because our needs are so intricately enmeshed with its. So as we were adjusting to this new world with very little instinctive signposting, our perception was plunged into the waters of chaos, and we found ourselves in a situation that we simply couldn't read. So we had no option but to create and then carry a learned internal symbol for every unique thing around with us. We had to effectively put one of each different thing into an internal Noah's Ark in the mind, if you will. And symbolic mapping like this is a tool, essentially. So it's made of Bridge 1, but it's a tool so significant that it folded all our other behavior into a new organizing principle, so that Bridge 2 became the lens through which at this point we had to see everything else, including Bridge 1. And for that reason, I'm drawing Bridge 2 as a concentric circle around us within the other shielding mediator of Bridge 1. It's more opaque than Bridge 1 because, of course, there's a problem. Instinct is written into our perception by the environment as a whole, including the behaviors of all the organisms within it across all the time, that's had some kind of influence on the present. So instinct is authored from an omniscient perspective, and rational thought is just something we impose upon our vast environment in the other direction from a far too limited perspective temporally and spatially to have any chance of deep veracity. More on this when we come to Bridge 3. Furthermore, because our rational thought is guided by our quest to survive, perfectly accurate contextual information that doesn't appear to serve that survival goal in the short term is information that we've lost from our perception through the now artificially curated form of natural selection our technologies impose upon us. So what I'm saying is, there's a large data set of accurate mapping information about our environment that became so inconvenient for us to know about that it had to go missing from our modern sober states. So I said I'd give examples of perception that's gone. We know our move to the savannah affected our psychedelic styles of responding to the world, and here are two more specific examples within that category of perception. In the rainforest, our instincts resonated so well with our environment that we could model it as a contiguous extension of our bodies. I've been describing in previous videos an external nervous system where we tune into the bigger brain of the forest. So by leaning into what felt good and fleeing from what felt bad, we were automatically enacting optimal behavior for our species and for the forest's benefit. And from this came a felt sense of omniscience, a bit like being a glass puzzle piece within a glass sheet, whose edges so perfectly fit into place that we could actually feel resonances within the far corners of the sheet, as though we were the entire glass sheet ourselves. On the savannah, however, our instincts no longer matched the environment's demands, and so leaning into what felt good, fleeing from what felt bad, believing our impressions, impulses and reactions no longer worked. And actually, we had to start modelling our environment as something starkly separate to ourselves, an unknowable stranger with whom everything must now be rationally negotiated through cold and calculating measurement. The truth, however, is that our environment really isn't separate from our bodies, and many religions have attempted to inform us the separation is just an illusion. Science tells us the same. We breathe the environment in and out, we eat it, we drink it, and our physical and behavioural output has to resonate with its features. And sure enough, when we take psychedelics, a feeling of complete continuity with us around is very often restored. So environmental continuity is one example of contextual information we've had to lose, not because it was inaccurate, but purely because modelling it like that was impeding our ability to survive a novel situation. Another example of accurate perception that's gone is our stunted impression of fungi and plants. We have very obvious feelings towards other animals: love, fear, repulsion. And that's because we're all guided by these instincts to keep us from eating the wrong organisms, to help us run away from what threatens us, and to ensure we tread lightly on others in our path. But we now have very little of that affinity with plants and fungi, and again, I believe that's because our dialogue with them stopped on the savannah. Where each used to signal through psychedelic visuals and feeling states, and also through once legible variations in colour, leaf shape and scent. Eat me, don't eat me, stay here, don't stay here. Our move meant that dialogue became misaligned and so had to be blocked out. There are still remnants of it. We find certain things beautiful and certain things ugly, but it's nowhere near comprehensive. Now, we couldn't block as much information out with the new animals we were encountering. They could tell us pretty quickly how to treat them through physical interaction. But the desirable relationships between us and the plants and fungi, the ways of relating that would preserve the environment as a whole was now not very transparent. So from this point onwards, it really became all about what worked for us. We didn't have as many legible deterrents from our environment that once kept us from harming the intricate webs of relationship that were important to the maintenance of other organisms. So ultimately, to stay in our lane, we should feel a lot more love and sensitivity towards the natural world than we do. But that's love and sensitivity that's gone missing, and it tends to come back when our rational thought is dialed down by the use of psychedelics. So those are a couple of areas of perception that have had to be deleted from our sober states, and they really are important aspects of mapping the way we need to relate to the world around us. It's quite clear that without this sense perception being fully functional, we are damaging our environment without being able to feel what we're doing. Our inaccurate reading of our situation after the fall or descent from the trees is what the Buddhists refer to as ignorance, and it's what Christianity refers to as sin. These two terms are operationally similar to each other, because if you're ignorant of your context, you can think you're doing good, but be sinful by accident. If I take my neighbour a nut roast, I might think that's a nice thing to do. Thousands wouldn't. But if the context is they have a nut allergy, then that could potentially kill them. If you can't read your environment, it's very hard to avoid damaging it accidentally at some point. And what this creates is a need for a special style of symbolic mapping, Bridge 2, that strives so hard to be in tune with environmental needs and demands that it folds all our activity, including Bridges 1 and 2, into a new overarching organizing principle that we call morality. So as a quick recap, Bridge 1 acknowledges our bodies need help in surviving the new environment. Bridge 2 admits our perception is falling short now. With Bridge 3, it's our compassion and ability to serve our surround, including other people and other organisms within it that we don't have a good sense of. We used to in the forest because our instincts had been authored in a way that kept our perception and behaviour in resonance with its needs. But out here on the savannah, that misalignment meant we didn't naturally behave in this resonant way. So this third bridge was a bit like the Ark of the Covenant, whose contents offered a code by which you could both tame and reap from a hostile environment in a sustainable way. This is like the rule book, and it's the crucial bridge that addresses the gulf between how we need to treat the environment so that it thrives, and we thrive in turn, and how we feel like treating it ordinarily, which is a lot less kindly than we need to. To do this, our ancestors first created religion as this moral arc, and then, as I'll discuss, we were gradually forced into creating science later on. From science came legal systems, secular morality, and several other things. And the difference between religion and science is religion tends towards dealing in qualities, and science tends towards quantities. A quality is a relational phenomenon that's evolved in our perception to ensure we respond to our environment as it needs us to remain fairly stable. So if you look at this diagram of us in the center of our original rainforest environment, I've drawn the qualitative perception between us and that surround, because it's really been written via the medium of ancestral interaction with the environmental items it's mapping. Styles of perception that engendered interaction closely resonant with ecological stability have been selected for, and the place where you actually find the qualities are in somebody's consciousness. So colour or scent, for example, these are qualities. And I would say the psychedelic images and feelings some organisms impose upon us are also examples of qualities. So because each style of perception is only selected for if it works to match the pattern of our responses to the pattern of what the environment needs from us, our collective palette of qualitative perception imparts an unfathomable amount of contextual information, again, authored from that omniscient perspective. That omniscience is easy to forget because a colour doesn't seem complex. A scent doesn't seem revelatory, but it is. It will cause a different sensation within us than it would cause within another animal that the environment required a different response from. Religion understood this qualitative perception as a necessary dialogue with the all, with early conceptions of a pantheistic God, and their aim was originally to restore those instinctive aspects of perception that had been overwritten by rational thought so that we could stay in line with our environment long term. So many ancient religions would attempt to resurrect these old instincts by using psychedelics or meditation or repetitive beats to dial down the default mode network and the rational thought it supported, and this would bring back our older sense of how things really were, because instinct uses different circuits in the brain that dial up when rational thought dials down. More on this mechanism in episode 2. The obvious problem with doing this is that those instincts were banished for a reason. They weren't completely aligned with our new situation, which wasn't the rainforest. So seeking them out and referring to them once more wouldn't work perfectly, and it was also an acknowledgement that this rational mapping we'd made with Bridge 2 didn't provide a sufficiently comprehensive reading of how to relate to our surround. It may have been a good improvised map that focused on what things were made of, but it clearly wasn't apprising us of some profound truths about reality that we now needed a window into, as it turned out. In fact, our ancestors valued the old psychedelic style of information our dormant instincts could provide so much that religious artifacts were created to bring the altered state's wisdom into the everyday without us needing to go into some kind of trance. And this was just as well, because we were also building up the rational networks in the brain so much as society became more complex and required that getting into an altered instinctive state using something like meditation was becoming harder and harder anyway. At this point, we see Western religions, such as Christianity, telling us a story about civilization killing or sacrificing the enlightened and godlike human being, symbolized in Christianity by Christ. And this sacrifice of Christ forges our sinners' compromise. We need civilization to protect us from nature, but that civilization requires so much rational thought that it kills the sane human being. It costs us our ability to relate to nature in a moral, in a sane or intelligent way. So it allows us to live on, but only in a state of ignorance and therefore sin. Instead of trying to get back the now askew qualitative reading of life and reality, these newer religions tried to represent all of nature's complexity with one sort of administrative God who would just give us a handbook of how to relate to modern things, societal things for the most part, and we would all just follow those moral rules by rote and in faith. Why? Because we're too imperfect physically and contextually to get back to the enlightened state where we'd be naturally sane and naturally moral. So old Eastern religions have tended to say about our problem, change your lifestyle to a monastic simplified one so your brain has less rational thought to engage it through the day, and then seek to de-rationalize the brain further by jamming that default mode network with things like meditation. And this way we can take ourselves back to a state of instinctive mapping that we call enlightenment. Western religion has just tended to say, press on with the advancement of society, but do be aware that you'll be doing it in an insane condition. So here's a handbook on how to make that work. And then as our societies became even more complicated and quite different to those in which the religions were established, the religious laws themselves became insufficient to police people. They were now askew. So we developed our secular laws that people stuck to, also by rote and often to avoid punishment. And here we can see science and rational thought building on its advantage over religion, in that science involves a continual process of asking our changing environment, whether it's man-made or natural, are you like this? Are you like this? Is this thing possible? Can we go in this direction? A kind of cerebral version of the old DNA dialogue, but it's now being conducted through rational thought, often theoretical thought, not through natural selection. And again, it describes phenomena in quantities instead of in qualities. A quantity is like a man-made quality. It's an artificial set of metrics with which we can measure apparently objective properties that aren't instinctively legible, such as exact weight, density, ingredients, behavior over observed time, etc. So on our diagram, within our new non-forest environment of the savannah, which would later become towns and cities, we haven't had the time to evolve a fully comprehensive qualitative perception of things around us here. Our dormant qualitative perception that we can sometimes access through altered states mirrors the forest, not this place. So obviously this is what proper qualitative perception would look like in the new situation. But again, we haven't had the time or the circumstance to develop that. So we've had to instead interrogate the ingredients of things and what we can observe and record through measurement. The metrics of this measurement come from bridges 1 and 2, a quantitative tool-based attitude to matter, bridge 1, and a quantitative tool-based attitude to meaning, bridge 2. So rational thought maps meaning only in terms of that which can be passed through bridges 1 and 2. And what it tends to leave out, that a qualitative reading doesn't, is a data set forged across time and ancestral consciousness. This data set that manifests through instinct compels and describes the most successful ancestral styles of interacting with one's surround that have historically served holistic environmental stability. So in recording and delivering a snapshot of history like this through time, interaction, and the resulting styles of consciousness, you could say qualitative perception is based on ecological empiricism. We tend to think of science as more objective than instinct. Galileo largely classified quantities as primary and qualities as secondary, because instinct, which is hard to measure and may seem variable, might appear quite subjective. And in a way, because it's askew with our modern situations, it's not a clear map of our surround today. But in another sense, the ecological empiricism upon which instinct is based means it's been authored by things that have happened over eons and strategies that have worked to model and deal with those things whilst benefiting the whole, not just the individual. So you can see how instinct does relate to a spiritual perspective, because it has that holographic quality of being authored by the all to describe the all within every instinctive compulsion, great and small. In largely discounting that temporal and perceptual data as secondary, science's idea about how to relate to things often comes down to how we'd like to relate to things, and without the guiding star of qualitative inherited memory, how we'd like to relate is unlikely to follow the shape of how things need to be perceived to serve environmental stability. Again, this inability we have to read and behave in resonance with environmental signals is what allows us to harm our environment without it registering that that's what's happening. We rely on science nonetheless because our instincts are misaligned, but this invocation of quantitative measurement actually increases the misalignment we have and blunts the accuracy of our instinctive perception even more. So in summary, with Bridge 3, we've got two approaches that both half work in fitting us into an unfamiliar environment. Religion attempts to dampen down complexity in Bridges 1 and 2 to hear nature's voice once again. The problem is that nature's voice describes to us the rainforest, and that's not our current environment. The other method of science attempts to simply pass all of nature through the two bridges we've got, and that's missing out a rich contextual data set about relating to things that's been passed on through time and inherited consciousness. The result of all this is that even though Bridge 3 purports to create a new organizing principle to orient all our behavior and perception so that we protect the environment as we take from it, in its very biased role as a tool for our survival, this bridge still ends up blocking out what damage we're doing that we can't afford to acknowledge. So in masquerading as nature's true voice, whether in science or religion, Bridge 3 tends to convey the idea that nature's desires are exactly what's convenient for us in the short term. Because that's not true, as far as I can tell, you can see these bridges are getting more opaque as we go along. They're making it harder to see what reality's like. Despite each bridge being less accurate, each is more immediate to us and so appears a more convincing portrayal of what reality is like. Bridge 1, tools, is constrained by the laws of physics, so tools are in some kind of dialogue with the natural world. Symbolic mapping, Bridge 2, is not quite as accountable to reality as tools were. The meaning assigned to items here needs only to map the territory for one's own purposes short term. One's own purposes long term would have to include the demands of the entire environment. Bridge 2 can't do that, so there's a bigger margin of error there. And once you get to Bridge 3, religious doctrine and science, which does attempt to do that, things here are even less easy to measure because a lot of this more macro contextual stuff is invisible in sober states. And yet religion and science are both so convincing to people that they persuade us that what we perceive through our sense perception, symbolic mapping, and personal logic is wrong. So, the world seems flat, but we know that's wrong. And because so many of these assertions are correct, like the world being round, we just become practiced in suspending our disbelief, whether we follow religion or science, and adhering to what our favoured version of Bridge 3 is telling us, even though evidence in this area is a lot harder to come by. This means that Bridge 3 is hugely helpful, it tells us a lot of correct information, but it does have an even bigger margin of error than Bridge 2 does. Each successive bridge is also more opaque because each is aligning us not with nature itself, but with the artificial style of relating to nature the previous bridge has created. So there's compounded estrangement building up here, and when the estrangement is such that all of life must be rationalized through a brain that's evolved to lean into instinct much more, we can address our fourth and final bridge. This, because it's a mandala, has been there all along and was also present before the first bridge. It's permeated all the other bridges as we've gone along, and this we can call our ego. Now, our previous bridges seem like rational constructs that we have to work at sustaining with continual attention. But there's only so much conscious self-coercion one can engage in without becoming mentally overtaxed. And it seems the brain itself tends towards making its own models of reality in favour of those that work locally, regardless of the wider context beyond. This ability may have been specially selected for in humans because we've had to be so adaptable. So with Bridge 4, the brain helps us automate the other bridges into a biologically based style of perception that works for our changing situation. So we can symbolise Bridge 4 with the brain. And the gulf it bridges is that between the style of perception and motivation we need to survive in our new environment and the style of perception and motivation we've evolved to have from our time in the forest. So if you imagine our ancestors moving to the savannah very fast, most things that motivated them suddenly became unavailable or different. So our primary modes of relating to everything had to be switched to novel modes of relation. This is what's allowed for the construction of each bridge we've discussed so far. And it's this switching ability, which had to become practically subconscious, that constitutes our false self or our ego. So at the time of leaving the rainforest, instead of relaxing in the trees with very few predators and an abundance of fruit, we suddenly had to work very hard to protect ourselves from novel predators and find novel food sources that we could process and make edible through hard work. We had to individuate from our environment, as discussed. We couldn't read it through some kind of external nervous system. We were deprived of our natural diet. We had to kill stuff that we felt love towards in order to survive. We couldn't even be our old promiscuous selves who belonged entirely to the group. We had to organize ourselves into child-rearing partnerships with one or a limited number of others because bringing up children was now so difficult. This all seems natural to us today, but back then, willfully transforming our responses to everything, going against type in almost every situation, made it very difficult to carve out a way forward and find the motivation we desperately needed to follow that challenging path. Religious stories imply that part of our desire to carry on after being evicted from our habitat, possibly by an environmental disaster, was our love for each other. Eve compelled Adam to commit the sin of self-awareness in the face of danger, perhaps symbolized by the snake. Snakes certainly seem to be a feature of dimethyltryptamine. They may signify danger. So, devising a false self, using a narrative bridge, let's say, to hook up new behaviors to old reward centers in the brain, and crucially to overwrite old styles of perception with new ones, such as our apparent separation from our environment. This was really the only way we could recalibrate our identities to pretend this new lifestyle was natural, tolerable, and possibly even fun. Now, in this therapy-literate society, we're aware the brain does have this capacity to recalibrate its motivations to just match the pattern of the environment that you're working with, even when it's not a good one. So we see things like Stockholm syndrome, where within an inescapable situation, the brain will fabricate a new narrative so that you like your captor. Because if you like your captor enough, you can acquire the rewarding chemistry you need to survive through trying to meet their needs. So you're now not seeing what reality's really like. You're seeing what you need to see in order to survive. And the same thing happened to us over time once we moved to the savannah. As with Bridge 3, Bridge 4 also has two poles within it. There's the culturally prescribed, more rational version of the self, informed by other people, by the media, by our schooling, by our newer religions and legal systems, and by corporate agendas and so on. This side has to be rationally constructed and cultivated over time. And then, as with the ancient religions in Bridge 3, we sometimes want to dial down all this rational activity and seek out our true selves so we can fortify the real person within. This is the other pole of Bridge 4. And we often turn to it when we fail to fit society's pattern. We become overwhelmed, burnt out. Many people enter into a style of open-hearted self-inquiry in the form of therapy. The rational pole of Bridge 4 is, after all, very difficult to cope with because it requires so much suppression that a lot of it is on the cusp of being subconscious. We have to concur with market forces to avoid starvation, for example. We usually adopt the religion and morality of our culture. And it's easy to see in amoral CEOs of massive companies the way they genuinely rationalize the harm they're doing through self-delusion. But it's a lot harder to see in ourselves, in most of our purchases and behaviors across any given day. So a big part of the modern cultural ego is completely willful insanity, a commitment to believing that what happens to be expedient is probably morally fine. Simultaneously, for anyone who does venture into the more spiritual aspect of Bridge 4, seeking the ancient, the sacred, the ineffable, felt sense of being sane, they're going to have a hard time finding that within our therapeutic industry, for whom being well adjusted means being adjusted to society. So as with religion, therapy, although hugely useful, life-saving, will always contain this massive margin of error. Sometimes guesswork, sometimes trial and error with plant and fungal chemistry in the form of pharmaceuticals that we've totally forgotten how to relate to. The other problem with the spiritual side of Bridge 4 is that to discover yourself and become enlightened takes such monasticism and simplicity and selfishness that only the wealthy and less troubled people in the West, certainly, can really pursue that as a goal for the most part. Wealth isn't bad, but it's often the product of pursuits that don't serve societal or environmental stability. So in those cases, it's almost as though people are having to sell their soul to bring about conditions in which they can win their soul back. The style of Bridge 4 through which most of us are looking is an increasingly rational one, and it admits that we'll have to think about true morality later because our first priority is to survive our society. And so just as our alienation on the savannah created the need for us to individuate from our surround, our skewed rat race culture engenders perceptual individualism, where we don't any longer feel love towards contemporaries, friends, kin, elders, and younger generations. These are now treated as commodities and unknowable strangers with whom we've learned to rationally negotiate for our own ends. We literally don't feel as much love as we need to remain a cohesive kind of group. And as always, that's love that tends to re-emerge when we get into altered states and dial down our rational thought. So here we have maximal obfuscation. Bridge 4 folds our previous organizing principle, which was a stab at working morality, into an apparently automated, biologically based operating system that assimilates, rationalizes, and perceives all the artifice around us and within us as natural. Again, this is a mandala that's circular because Bridge 4 is the precursor to Bridge 1. Having an ego was what allowed us to think beyond our instinctive programming, to break with nature and hack our environment in service to our needs using tools. Back then, when we first decided to do this to stay alive, we had a functioning moral instinct that truly related to the needs of the organisms around us. So I believe that made us aware that what we were doing was morally wrong, a novel move against nature in favor of personal survival. Our ancient religions do seem very aware of this. The reason I've drawn Bridge 4 as our last and not our first is because after its presence potentiated the other bridges, it remained our innermost lens and simply became populated by the others over time as they accrued these karmic debts. Each bridge is in fact made of its three predecessors, so that increasing sophistication in any one needs to be built from the material and activity within the others. Before I conclude, a very quick note on where we are now with the advancement of technology and its stronger presence within our sense of self. As we enter the age of artificial intelligence, I'm afraid we're about to traverse this same circle once more, only now we'll be twice removed from nature's voice. Instead of using tools, Bridge 1, to serve us, we'll have to reshape our ways of being into the dynamics that serve the machine. When we get to Bridge 2, we'll have to see and respond to the world not through our own symbolic mapping, which was bad enough, but through the machine's new prompts and linguistics that see all of reality through the lens of market forces. Why? Because it's market forces that keep the machine alive. Once at Bridge 3, artificial intelligence will have more computing power to try to make sense of the dynamics of true morality. But what it won't have is any first-hand experience of the temporal and perceptual data that comes to humans through instincts like love, like fear, like awe, like reverence. And these guiding instincts have been selected for through the conscious and temporal aspects of reality to deliver data which is as important to the stability of the biological enterprise as the laws of physics are to the stability of the material one. In fact, those phenomena themselves may be expressions of the same group of forces. This machine-led direction of travel is unwittingly striving for human automation and a kind of sentience shorn of agency with artificially compelled aims. And so at this point, we've arrived where we started. But unlike T.S. Eliot, we see things a lot less clearly than when we set off. These bridges are concentric circles which increasingly obscure the mechanics of the natural environment beyond society. And I believe this is what our major religions have been telling us. Just because they differ in how they describe our impairment and what information we're missing doesn't mean they're each telling a different story. They may be telling the same story, but from varying points in history where our perceptual problems were differently advanced. For all the considerable trouble religions have caused us, I don't mean to diminish that. They are still the one aspect of culture that apprises us of our imperfection in context and seeks to mitigate against it, even though that's a near impossible task. Whether it's useful or not for us to know this, one direction on this mandala brings increasing insanity, and the other direction promises greater freedom from it. Thanks very much for watching.